The billionaire tried to leave quietly. Maid's Toddler stopped the billionaire with a hug. Marcus Thornfield had perfected the art of not seeing people. Not really seeing them anyway. At 33, he built an empire that stretched across 3 continents, transforming a modest inheritance into a tech fortune worth $7 billion. His days were measured in acquisitions and stock prices, his nights in charity galas where checkbooks replaced genuine concern. The people who kept his world running smoothly, the drivers, the assistants, the household staff, existed in his peripheral vision, acknowledged with curt nods and the occasional grunt of approval. Among these invisible people was Elena Martinez, though Marcus couldn't have told you her name if his life depended on it. She was simply the maid, one of several who rotated through his sprawling Connecticut estate. What he didn't know was that Elena had her own empire to manage, one that demanded infinitely more courage than his ever had. Elena was 28 years old and had been cleaning Marcus's study for the past 6 months, always arriving at dawn when the house was still draped in silence. She moved like a ghost through the marble hallways, her worn sneakers making no sound against the imported Italian tile. In her backpack, alongside the extra uniform and the sandwich she'd eat during her 15-minute lunch break, was a folder of medical bills that grew thicker each week. Her daughter, Sophie, had been born with a congenital heart defect that required constant monitoring and medication that insurance only partially covered. Sophie was 3 years old, with her mother's warm brown eyes and a smile that could light up the darkest room. Most days, Elena dropped her at a daycare center that opened at 6 in the morning to accommodate parents with impossible schedules. But today was different. The daycare had closed unexpectedly due to a burst pipe, and Elena's backup sitter had the flu. With no other options and the threat of losing a day's pay looming, Elena had made the desperate decision to bring Sophie to work. "You have to be very, very quiet," Elena had whispered to her daughter in the car, meeting those trusting eyes in the rearview mirror. "Like a little mouse, okay? Mommy needs you to stay in the kitchen and color. Can you do that for me?" Sophie had nodded solemnly, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit. She was a good child, accustomed to making herself small and unobtrusive in a world that had little patience for her existence. The morning passed in Elena's usual blur of polishing and vacuuming and scrubbing. She checked on Sophie every 30 minutes, finding her daughter exactly where she'd left her, coloring with fierce concentration at the kitchen table the staff used. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Chun, had given Elena a warning look but said nothing. Everyone knew Elena was a good worker who never asked for favors. This one transgression could be overlooked. Marcus, meanwhile, was in his study fielding calls from London and Tokyo, oblivious to the small drama unfolding in his own home. His assistant had just confirmed his departure for Singapore that afternoon, a crucial meeting with investors that could unlock his next billion. He was already mentally halfway across the Pacific when Mrs. Chen knocked on his door. "Mr. Thornfield, the car will be ready in 20 minutes to take you to the airport," she said in her crisp, professional tone. Marcus nodded without looking up from his laptop.
"Fine.
"Make sure my luggage is in the car." What he didn't see was Mrs. Chen's slight frown, the way her eyes darted toward the kitchen. She'd been managing his household for 5 years and had learned to anticipate problems before they became visible to him. But some things, she knew, were beyond even her considerable powers to control. Elena was in the West Wing bathroom, scrubbing tile grout with the kind of focused intensity that came from needing to forget when she heard it. A crash. Then silence. Then a wail that made every maternal instinct in her body scream in alarm. She dropped her brush and ran, her heart hammering against her ribs. The kitchen. The crash had come from the kitchen. What she found there made time stop. The antique vase, the one Mrs. Chun had specifically warned everyone about, the one Marcus's grandmother had brought back from China in 1952, the one that was probably worth more than Elena made in a year, lay in pieces on the floor. And in the middle of the shattered porcelain sat Sophie, her little face crumpled in terror, colorful shards surrounding her like fallen leaves. I'm sorry, Mama, Sophie sobbed, her voice breaking. I just wanted to see the pretty flowers on it.
I didn't mean to.
Elena's hands shook as she lifted her daughter, checking frantically for cuts. A small scratch on Sophie's palm, nothing serious, but the damage was done. The vase was irreplaceable, and Marcus Thornfield, she knew with the certainty of the powerless, would never forgive this. Mrs. Chun, she called out, her voice surprisingly steady. I need you, please. The older woman appeared within seconds, taking in the scene with one comprehensive glance. Her expression softened when she saw Sophie's tears, but her words were firm. You need to tell him yourself, Elena. He's leaving for the airport in 15 minutes. I know. Elena set Sophie down carefully and knelt among the broken pieces, gathering them with trembling hands as if somehow, by collecting every shard, she could undo what had been done. Can you watch her? Just for a moment. Mrs. Chen nodded, and Elena walked toward Marcus's study on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. With every step, she calculated, the vase would cost more than she could pay. She would lose this job. Without this job, she couldn't afford Sophie's medications. Without the medications, she couldn't finish that thought. Instead, she knocked on the heavy oak door, each rap of her knuckles feeling like a nail in her own coffin. Come in, came the impatient voice from inside. Marcus didn't look up when she entered. He was shoving papers into his briefcase with the efficiency of someone who had mastered the art of perpetual departure. Elena stood in the doorway, invisible as always, waiting for him to acknowledge her existence. Yes, he said finally, still not looking at her. What is it? Mr. Thornfield. Elena began, and her voice caught. She cleared her throat and tried again. There's been an accident. Your grandmother's vase, the Chinese one in the kitchen, it's been broken. It was my fault. I take full responsibility. For the first time in 6 months, Marcus Thornfield actually looked at Elena Martinez. Really looked at her. The silence that followed Elena's confession stretched like taffy, pulling tighter and tighter until the air felt too thin to breathe. Marcus set down his briefcase with deliberate care, and Elena watched his jaw tighten in a way that made her stomach drop. The Chinese vase, he repeated, his voice flat and cold. The one from my grandmother's collection. Yes, sir. I'm so sorry. I'll pay for it. However long it takes, I'll. Do you have any idea what that was worth? He stood now, and Elena felt herself shrink back involuntarily. She'd seen him from a distance dozens of times, but never like this, never with his full attention focused on her like a laser. His eyes were the color of slate, and just as hard. No, sir, she whispered. But I'll find a way to. $30,000. The number landed between them like a bomb. It was appraised at $30,000. It was one of the last things my grandmother gave me before she died. Elena felt the room tilt. $30,000. She would never earn that much, not if she worked for him for years. Not if she gave up every cent she made and let Sophie's medical bills pile up until. The thought made her sway on her feet, and Marcus noticed. Something flickered across his face, too quick to name, before the mask of cold fury returned. I want you out of my house, he said. You're fired. Mrs. Chun will calculate what you owe, and you'll receive the paperwork for a payment plan. Now get out. I have a plane to catch. Elena nodded, unable to speak past the boulder lodged in her throat. She turned to leave, each step an exercise in not falling apart. Not yet. Not where he could see. She'd made it to the hallway when Sophie's voice rang out, high and clear. Mama. Elena's heart stopped. She turned to see her daughter running down the hallway, Mrs. Chun hurrying behind her with an apologetic expression. Sophie must have slipped away, while the housekeeper's attention was divided. Now she was heading straight for Elena, her little legs pumping, her face still streaked with tears. Mama, I'm sorry about the pretty bowl. Please don't be sad. Marcus appeared in the doorway of his study, and Elena saw the exact moment he registered Sophie's presence. His eyebrows drew together in confusion, then irritation. Who is this child? Why is there a child in my house? Before Elena could answer, Sophie crashed into her legs, wrapping her small arms around Elena's knees. Elena bent to scoop her up, to get her out of Marcus Thornfield's sight as quickly as possible, but Sophie was already talking. I broke the pretty bowl, not Mama, she announced, turning to look at Marcus with the fearless honesty of a 3-year-old. It was an accident. I just wanted to see the flowers on it. Marcus stared at the child in his hallway, this small person who had somehow materialized in his carefully controlled world. She had chocolate smudges on her cheeks and wild curls escaping from a lopsided ponytail. She wore a faded Sesame Street t-shirt and light-up sneakers with dying batteries that flickered weakly with every movement. Mr. Thornfield, Elena said quickly, I'm so sorry. The daycare was closed, and I had no one to watch her. I know I should have called in sick, but I couldn't afford to miss the day. This is entirely my fault. Sophie shouldn't have been anywhere near your things. The child broke it, Marcus said slowly, as if trying to process this new information. And you were going to take the blame. She's 3 years old, Elena said, and there was steel in her voice now, the kind that only mothers possess. She doesn't understand value or consequences. I'm the adult. I'm responsible. Marcus looked at Elena, really looked at her for perhaps the second time ever, and saw things he'd never noticed before. The exhaustion carved into the fine lines around her eyes. The worn fabric of her uniform, clean but threadbare at the seams. The way she held her daughter, protective and fierce, like she was the only thing standing between Sophie and a hostile world. Which, he realized with uncomfortable clarity, she was. You can't pay $30,000, he said. It wasn't a question. I'll find a way, Elena replied, but they both knew it was a lie. A necessary lie, the kind you tell to maintain dignity when you have nothing else left. Sophie, oblivious to the tension crackling between the adults, reached out toward Marcus. You're very tall, she observed. Are you a giant? Sophie, no, Elena said sharply, pulling her daughter's hand back. We don't bother Mr. Thornfield. But Marcus found himself taking a step forward, drawn by something he couldn't name. Up close, he could see that Sophie's eyes were the same warm brown as her mother's, but they held something Elena's didn't. Uncomplicated trust. This child was looking at him not as a billionaire or an employer, but simply as another person sharing space in the world. I'm not a giant, he said, and his voice came out gentler than he'd intended. Just tall. Sophie giggled, a sound like bells. I'm short. Mama says I'll grow, though. Mrs. Chen cleared her throat delicately. Mr. Thornfield, your car is here. You have 40 minutes to make your flight. Marcus glanced at his watch, then at Elena and Sophie, then back at his watch. The rational part of his brain was screaming at him to leave, to get in the car, to make the flight to Singapore where 20 serious men in expensive suits were waiting to hand him another $1 billion. That was what mattered. That was what he'd spent his entire adult life building toward. But something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the way Elena stood there, spine straight despite the fear in her eyes, ready to shoulder a debt that would crush her. Maybe it was Sophie's curious gaze, so free of the judgment and calculation he was used to seeing in adults. Or maybe it was the sudden, uncomfortable recognition that he was about to destroy 2 lives over an object, a thing, something that couldn't love him back no matter how much his grandmother had cherished it. I need to think about this, he heard himself say. Elena, take your daughter to the kitchen. We'll discuss this when I return from Singapore. Elena's eyes widened. But sir, your flight. I said when I return. The words came out harsher than he meant them to, a defense against the unfamiliar feeling stirring in his chest. You're not to leave the premises until we've settled this. Understood? Yes, sir, Elena whispered, and Marcus could see her trying to calculate whether this was mercy or cruelty, a stay of execution, or just a prolonged one. He didn't know himself. All he knew was that getting in the car right now, leaving this unresolved, felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. He grabbed his briefcase and strode toward the front door, where his driver waited. Mrs. Chen followed, her expression unreadable. "Sir," she said quietly as they reached the car, "that vase wasn't actually worth 30,000. Marcus stopped. "What?" "It was a replica. Your grandmother had the original in her estate sale before she passed. She felt guilty about it and had a copy made for your house. I have the paperwork in my files. It was worth about $300. The confession should have made him angry. Another lie, another deception in a life built on carefully managed truths. Instead, Marcus felt something close to relief flooding through him, followed immediately by a much more uncomfortable emotion: shame. He'd been willing to ruin Elena's life over what he believed was an irreplaceable heirloom. But even now, knowing the truth, he recognized that to Elena, $300 might as well be 300,000. The gap between them was so vast that the specific numbers barely mattered. "Why didn't you tell her?" Marcus asked. Mrs. Chen met his eyes steadily. "Because I wanted to see what you would do. And because she didn't ask about the value. She just apologized and offered to make it right, even though it was her child's accident." She paused. "That woman works 3 jobs, Mr. Thornfield. She's here 5 mornings a week, she cleans offices in the evening, and she does weekend shifts at a diner. She does all of that to pay for her daughter's heart medication." The words landed like punches. Marcus stood frozen, his hand on the car door, the engine idling. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably his assistant wondering where he was. The Singapore investors would be checking their watches, growing impatient. Billions of dollars hung in the balance. And yet, for the first time in years, Marcus Thornfield found himself wondering if he was running towards something or away from it. Singapore had been a spectacular success, at least by the metrics that Marcus had always used to measure such things. The investors had signed, the deal had closed, and his net worth had ticked upward by another comfortable margin. He'd spent 3 days in hermetically sealed conference rooms, 3 nights in a hotel suite overlooking the glittering cityscape, and not a single moment when he hadn't been thinking about a woman he'd barely noticed, and a 3-year-old child in light-up sneakers. The flight back to Connecticut felt interminable. Marcus tried to work, to review documents, to return emails, but found his concentration fracturing. He kept seeing Sophie's face, the way her fear had transformed into curiosity when she looked at him. He kept hearing Elena's voice. "She's 3 years old. She doesn't understand value or consequences." But what bothered him most was Mrs. Chen's quiet revelation: 3 jobs. Heart medication. The mathematics of desperation sketched themselves in his mind, and for someone who'd built an empire on numbers, these particular calculations made him feel sick. When his car finally pulled through the gates of his estate, it was late afternoon. Golden light slanted through the old oak trees that lined the driveway, and for the first time in recent memory, Marcus actually noticed how beautiful his home was. Strange, he thought, how you could live somewhere for years and never really see it until you tried to imagine it through someone else's eyes. Mrs. Chen met him in the foyer, taking his briefcase with practiced efficiency. "Welcome back, Mr. Thornfield. I trust the trip was successful." "Successful enough," Marcus said, shrugging off his jacket. "Is she still here, Elena?" Mrs. Chen's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "She's in the kitchen. She's been coming every day, working her regular shifts. I didn't think you wanted her to leave." Marcus nodded and found himself walking toward the kitchen before he'd consciously decided to do so. He could hear voices as he approached, Elena's low and melodic and Sophie's higher-pitched, chattering about something involving a turtle and a magical garden. He paused in the doorway unnoticed. Elena was on her knees scrubbing the baseboards, while Sophie sat at the staff table with a coloring book. The little girl was narrating an elaborate story to her stuffed rabbit, complete with different voices for each character. Elena would occasionally add a comment or ask a question, never breaking her rhythm with a scrub brush. It was such a simple scene, and yet Marcus felt like he was witnessing something profound. This was what life looked like when you were actually living it, he realized, not just moving through it on the way to the next achievement. "Hello," he said, and both heads snapped toward him. Elena scrambled to her feet, nearly dropping her brush. "Mr. Thornfield, I didn't hear you come in. Welcome back. You're the giant," Sophie announced happily. "Mama, it's the giant man." "Sophie, hush," Elena said, her cheeks flushing. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll take her to."
"No."
The word came out too loud, and both Elena and Sophie startled. Marcus softened his tone. "I mean stay. I'd like to talk to you. Both of you, actually." He pulled out a chair at the staff table and sat down, a gesture so unprecedented that Elena looked around as if checking for witnesses to this impossible sight. Marcus Thornfield, billionaire, sitting at the kitchen table where his employees ate their lunches. "Please," he said, gesturing to the other chairs. "Sit." Elena sat slowly, perching on the edge of her seat like a bird ready to take flight. Sophie, with the unself-consciousness of childhood, climbed into the chair next to Marcus and smiled at him. "Did you go on an airplane?" she asked. "Mama says you go on airplanes a lot." "I did," Marcus replied, finding himself answering this child with more honesty than he'd given the Singapore investors. "I went very far away and talked to some people about work." "Was it fun?" Marcus considered the question. In the past, he would have said yes automatically. Success was fun. Winning was fun. But sitting in this warm kitchen with afternoon light pooling on the worn table, he found himself answering differently. "Not particularly," he admitted. "Not as fun as being home." Sophie nodded sagely. "Mama says home is where your heart lives." "My heart lives with Mama." The innocence of it struck Marcus silent. When was the last time he'd thought about where his heart lived? Did it live anywhere? Or had he traded it somewhere along the way for stock options and quarterly returns? Elena cleared her throat. "Mr. Thornfield, I've been setting aside money for the vase. I know it won't be enough for a long time, but I wanted you to know I'm taking this seriously. I have about $200 so far." Marcus looked at this woman who cleaned his baseboards and worked 3 jobs and was trying to scrape together money she needed for her daughter's medication to pay him back for something that was barely worth more than she'd already saved. The absurdity of it, the cruel mathematics of inequality, hit him with unexpected force. "The vase cost $300, he said quietly. Elena blinked. "I'm sorry. It was a replica. My grandmother sold the original before she died. Mrs. Chun has the paperwork." He watched Elena's face cycle through confusion, relief, and then something that might have been anger. "I'm sorry. I should have verified before I said what I said." 300, Elena repeated, and then she laughed, a sound caught between humor and hysteria. $300. And I thought I'd be paying it off for years. "I was angry," Marcus said, and the admission felt like pulling splinters from his own skin. "I didn't stop to think. I didn't stop to ask. I just reacted." Sophie, who had been coloring quietly, looked up at him with those impossibly trusting eyes. "It's okay to make mistakes," she said with the authority of someone who'd been told this many times. "Mama says what matters is you say sorry and try to be better." Out of the mouths of babes, Marcus thought, and felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. "Your daughter is very wise," he said to Elena, who was wiping at her eyes with the corner of her sleeve. "She's everything," Elena whispered. "She's my whole world." And there it was, the thing Marcus had been circling around for 3 days and 12,000 miles. This woman had a whole world, and it fit in a 3-year-old body with a lopsided ponytail. What did he have? Spreadsheets, properties, numbers in accounts that he'd never spend. "Tell me about the heart medication," Marcus heard himself say. Elena stiffened. I don't need charity, Mr. Thornfield. I'm not offering charity. I'm asking a question. Sophie piped up before her mother could answer. I have a special heart, she explained, placing her small hand on her chest. It doesn't work exactly right, so I need medicine to help it. Mama says I'm brave because I take my medicine every day without crying. She is brave, Elena said, her voice fierce with pride. She's the bravest person I know. Marcus felt something crack open inside his chest, some long-sealed chamber he'd locked away when he decided that feelings were inefficient, that caring too much was a liability in business. But Sophie's hand on her heart, Elena's fierce love, the way they'd built a whole world out of scraps and determination, it was more valuable than anything he'd acquired in Singapore. I'd like to make you a proposition, he said slowly, working out the details even as he spoke. Not charity. A job opportunity. Elena's eyes narrowed with suspicion. What kind of job? I need someone to manage my household properly. Mrs. Chun is getting ready to retire. She hasn't told me yet, but I can see it. I need someone who understands what it means to run a home, not just maintain a property. He leaned forward. I'd like you to train as a replacement. It would come with a significant salary increase, health insurance, and housing if you wanted it. There's a cottage on the property that's sitting empty. Elena stared at him like he'd started speaking a foreign language. Mr. Thornfield, I'm a maid. I clean bathrooms and scrub floors. I don't. You work 3 jobs, Marcus interrupted. You manage a household of your own on almost no resources. You budget, you plan, you solve problems. Those are exactly the skills I need. He paused. And the health insurance would cover Sophie's medications completely. He watched Elena process this information, saw the exact moment when hope flickered in her eyes before caution tamped it down. Why? She asked simply. Why would you do this? Marcus looked at Sophie, who was watching him with those clear, trusting eyes, and then back at Elena. Because your daughter is right, he said. It's okay to make mistakes. What matters is saying sorry and trying to be better. He took a breath. I've been running away from my own life for so long that I forgot what it meant to actually live in it. You too reminded me. So this is me trying to be better. The silence that followed was broken by Sophie sliding out of her chair and walking over to Marcus. She looked up at him seriously, then held up her arms. Mama says hugs make everything better when someone is sad. Sophie. Elena started, but Marcus was already moving. He slid out of his chair and crouched down to Sophie's level, and the little girl wrapped her arms around his neck with the unself-conscious affection of childhood. She smelled like crayons and apple juice and something else, something that might have been hope. Thank you, he whispered into her wild curls, and felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. It took him a moment to recognize it as happiness, simple and uncomplicated and real. When Sophie pulled back, she was smiling. You're not a giant, she announced. You're just a very tall friend. Marcus looked at Elena over her daughter's head and saw tears streaming down her face. I don't know what to say, she managed. Say yes, Marcus replied. Say you'll give me a chance to do something right. Elena wiped her eyes and nodded, unable to speak, and in that moment, Marcus Thornfield understood that the most valuable acquisition he'd ever made had nothing to do with profit margins or market share. It was simply this: the chance to be part of something real. The following weeks transformed Marcus's estate in ways both visible and invisible. Elena moved into the cottage with Sophie, a 2-bedroom structure that had once housed the property's original groundskeeper. It needed work. The plumbing was temperamental and the windows rattled in their frames, but to Elena, who'd been living in a 1-bedroom apartment where the walls were so thin you could hear the neighbors' arguments, it was a palace. Marcus found himself drawn to the cottage in the evenings, ostensibly to check on renovations, but really to witness the small miracle of their presence. He'd arrive with his tie loosened and his briefcase in hand to find Sophie's artwork taped to the refrigerator, Elena's shoes by the door, the smell of actual cooking, not the catered meals his own kitchen produced, but real food made with care. Mrs. Chun had been, in her understated way, delighted by the arrangement. About time this place felt like a home instead of a museum, she'd said, and had thrown herself into training Elena with the dedication of a general preparing her successor. Elena proved to be a remarkably quick study. She had an intuitive understanding of household systems, could spot inefficiencies that had existed for years, and brought a warmth to staff management that had been sorely lacking. The other employees, who'd initially been suspicious of her sudden elevation, soon became her loyal supporters. She remembered their children's names, asked about their weekends, and treated them like human beings rather than interchangeable cogs in a machine. Marcus watched this transformation from his study window and felt something shift in his understanding of what leadership actually meant. He'd built companies, managed thousands of employees, made decisions that affected entire markets. But he'd never created the kind of loyalty Elena inspired simply by seeing people. Sophie, meanwhile, had become the estate's unofficial mascot. She would accompany Elena on her rounds, a tiny shadow with a toy cleaning set that Marcus had ordered after catching her trying to help with a dust mop twice her size. The gardeners saved flowers for her to plant. The chef let her help make cookies. Even stern Mr. Patterson, who maintained the cars, had been spotted giving her rides in the golf cart around the property. "She's got everyone wrapped around her finger," Mrs. Chin observed one morning as they watched Sophie supervise the window washing from a safe distance. "She's special," Marcus agreed, and realized he meant it. There was something about Sophie's unfiltered joy, her ability to find wonder in everything from a ladybug to a marble staircase, that made the world seem fuller. It was a Thursday evening when everything shifted again. Marcus was in his study reviewing contracts when he heard the sound, terrified screaming that made his blood freeze. He dropped his papers and ran, his heart hammering, following the sound to the cottage. Elena was on the phone with emergency services, her face white as bone, while Sophie lay on the couch making sounds no child should make, her small body rigid, her lips tinged blue. "What happened?" Marcus demanded. "Her heart. She's having an episode. They're coming, but the nearest hospital is 20 minutes, and I don't know if..." Elena's voice broke. Marcus didn't think. He scooped Sophie into his arms, feeling how small she was, how fragile. "My helicopter," he said. "I can have us at Children's Hospital in Hartford in 10 minutes. Elena stared at him. "You have a helicopter?" "At the hangar. 5 minutes from here." He was already moving, carrying Sophie toward his car, Elena running beside him. "Call them back. Tell them to meet us there instead." The next 15 minutes were the longest of Marcus's life. He drove with one hand while Elena sat in the back, holding Sophie, singing to her in a shaking voice, promising her everything would be okay. Marcus called ahead, mobilizing resources he'd never thought to use for anything but business emergencies. His pilot met them at the hangar, the helicopter already running. They lifted off into the darkening sky, and Marcus held Elena's free hand while she held Sophie, the three of them connected in a chain of desperation and hope. The hospital was ready when they landed on the roof. Doctors and nurses descended like a well-orchestrated army, lifting Sophie onto a gurney, hooking her to monitors, speaking in calm voices while their hands moved with urgent precision. Elena tried to follow, but a nurse gently held her back. "They need room to work," the nurse said kindly. "You can see her soon. Let them stabilize her first." Elena stood frozen in the hallway, still wearing her work clothes, her hair disheveled, her face streaked with tears. Marcus put his arm around her shoulders, and she collapsed against him, sobbing. "She's going to be okay," he said, with more conviction than he felt. "She has to be okay." They waited in a room designed for waiting, with its pastel walls and uncomfortable chairs and magazines nobody could focus on reading. Marcus made calls to his lawyers, to his insurance people, to specialists he'd never needed before but could afford now. He arranged for the best pediatric cardiologist in the country to be consulted. He threw money at the problem because it was what he knew how to do, even though he understood with cold clarity that some things couldn't be bought. Elena sat with her head in her hands, and Marcus sat beside her, his hand on her back, offering the only thing he had left to give, his presence. "I thought I was doing everything right," Elena whispered. "I followed the medication schedule exactly. I watched for symptoms. I did everything the doctors said." "This isn't your fault," Marcus said firmly. "You're an incredible mother. Anyone can see that. If we'd been at the apartment, if we'd been 20 minutes from the hospital," she couldn't finish the sentence. "But you weren't," Marcus said. "You were at the estate. You had resources. That's what saved her, Elena. You being there, me being there, we got her here in time." A doctor appeared in the doorway, still in surgical scrubs, and both Elena and Marcus shot to their feet. "She's stable," the doctor said, and Elena's knees buckled. Marcus caught her, held her up. "It was a serious arrhythmia, but we've got it under control. She's going to need to stay for observation, possibly some adjustments to her medication, but she's going to be fine." Elena was crying too hard to speak, so Marcus asked the questions. What caused it? What could prevent it happening again? What did Sophie need long-term? The doctor answered patiently, explaining about Sophie's condition, about the likelihood of her needing surgery in the next few years, about management and monitoring, and all the complex realities of raising a child with a chronic condition. "Can I see her?" Elena finally managed. "Of course. Come with me." They followed the doctor down sterile hallways to a room where Sophie lay in a bed that dwarfed her, connected to monitors that beeped steadily, reassuringly. Her eyes were closed, her face peaceful in sleep, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. Elena went to her daughter's side and took her small hand, pressing it to her lips. Marcus hung back, feeling like an intruder on this intimate moment, but Sophie's eyes fluttered open. "Mama," she said drowsily. "We went on a helicopter. Like the giant, like Marcus said, he has." "We did, baby," Elena said, smoothing Sophie's curls. "How do you feel?" "Tired. But okay." Sophie's eyes found Marcus hovering in the doorway. "Are you okay? You look sad." Marcus felt his throat tighten. This child had just experienced something terrifying, was lying in a hospital bed with tubes and wires attached to her small body, and she was worried about him. "I'm okay now," he said, moving closer. "I was worried about you." Sophie smiled, that radiant smile that seemed to light up the room despite the fluorescent overhead lights. "Mama says friends take care of each other. You took care of us." Friends. The word hit Marcus with unexpected force. When was the last time he'd had a real friend? Not business associates or networking contacts, but someone who cared about him beyond what he could do for them? He'd sacrificed friendship on the altar of success, told himself he didn't need it, that connection was weakness. But looking at Sophie's trusting face and Elena's exhausted gratitude, Marcus realized he'd been wrong about almost everything that mattered. "I did," he said softly. "Because you're right. Friends take care of each other." Sophie's eyes were already closing again, medication and exhaustion pulling her back toward sleep. Elena looked up at Marcus, and in her eyes he saw something that took his breath away. Not gratitude, not obligation, but recognition. She saw him, really saw him, maybe for the first time. "Thank you," she said simply. "You saved her life." "We saved her life," Marcus corrected. "Together." And in that hospital room, under the fluorescent lights, something fundamental shifted between them. They were no longer employer and employee, billionaire and maid. They were two people who'd stood together in the darkness and pulled a little girl back into the light. Marcus stayed at the hospital all night, dozing in an uncomfortable chair while Elena kept vigil by Sophie's bed. When dawn broke through the windows, painting the room in shades of pink and gold, Sophie woke up asking for pancakes, and Marcus knew with absolute certainty that she was going to be fine. But he also knew, with equal certainty, that he was not the same person he'd been before a 3-year-old in light-up sneakers had crashed into his carefully ordered life and cracked it open. 3 months after Sophie's hospital stay, Marcus Thornfield sat in his study on a Saturday morning and realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd checked his stock portfolio. This observation, which would have horrified him a year ago, now made him smile. The estate had undergone a subtle transformation. There were still the marble floors and the imported furniture, the priceless art and the manicured gardens. But now there were also crayon drawings on the refrigerator in the main kitchen, a swing set visible from the study window, and the frequent sound of laughter echoing through halls that had once been library quiet. Elena had officially taken over from Mrs. Chin the previous month, and the transition had been seamless. She'd implemented new systems that made the household run more efficiently, while somehow making it feel less like a machine and more like a home. Staff turnover, which had been a constant problem, had dropped to nearly zero. People wanted to work for Elena Martinez, who remembered birthdays and asked about sick parents and created an environment where employees felt valued rather than interchangeable. Marcus had watched this transformation with something approaching awe. Elena had a gift he'd never possessed, the ability to make people feel seen. She did it without effort, without calculation, simply because she genuinely cared. And in caring, she'd created something he'd spent millions trying to achieve, a sense of belonging. Sophie had recovered beautifully from her episode, though it had been a wake-up call about the seriousness of her condition. Marcus had insisted on covering all her medical expenses, overriding Elena's protests by pointing out that his health insurance covered dependents of household staff, which was technically true even if he'd had to rewrite the policy to make it so. The little girl had recently started preschool at an exclusive private academy nearby, and Marcus had discovered the peculiar joy of hearing about her day over dinner. He'd gotten into the habit of joining Elena and Sophie for meals several times a week, drawn by something he couldn't quite name but knew he needed. They'd become, in some unconventional way, a family. Not in any way Marcus had imagined family could look, but real nonetheless. Sophie called him Marcus with the easy familiarity of childhood, though she'd occasionally slip and call him the giant when she was excited. Elena had relaxed around him, stopped treating him like an employer and more like, what? A friend, certainly. But lately, Marcus had begun to wonder if it was something more. The way she laughed at his dry observations about business calls. The way she'd started leaving books she thought he'd enjoy on his desk. The way her face lit up when he walked into a room, a brightness that had nothing to do with professional courtesy and everything to do with genuine pleasure at his presence. And on his side, the way his day felt incomplete until he'd seen her. The way he found himself making excuses to stop by the cottage. The way he'd catch himself watching her move through the world with Sophie, the two of them a matched set of grace and joy, and feel his chest tighten with want. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely unprecedented. Marcus Thornfield, who dated models and celebrities and calculated every relationship as a potential asset or liability, had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with his household manager and her 3-year-old daughter. He was contemplating this realization, turning it over in his mind like a jewel, when Sophie burst into his study without knocking, which was her usual method of entry. Marcus, you have to come see. Mama and I made a fort. Marcus looked up from his laptop, where a spreadsheet full of numbers that suddenly seemed utterly meaningless glowed on the screen. A fort. In the living room. It's huge. Come on. She grabbed his hand with sticky fingers. She'd apparently been eating something with jam, and tugged insistently. Marcus allowed himself to be pulled from his chair, from his work, from his old life, and followed Sophie through the house to the formal living room he never used. There, constructed from couch cushions and blankets and what appeared to be several dining room chairs, was indeed a fort. String lights had been woven through the structure, giving it a magical glow. Elena emerged from the fort's entrance, her hair tied back in a messy bun, wearing jeans and one of his old Yale sweatshirts that he'd left in the cottage weeks ago and she'd apparently claimed. She looked nothing like the professional household manager in her crisp uniform and everything like someone he could spend the rest of his life looking at. "Sorry," she said, gesturing at the chaos. Sophie had a vision, and you know how she gets when she has a vision. "I have no idea how she gets," Marcus said, but he was smiling. "Why don't you show me?" Sophie grabbed his other hand, and together she and Elena pulled him into the fort. Inside, it was warm and cozy, lit by the string lights and floored with what appeared to be every pillow in the house. A stack of picture books waited in one corner, and Sophie's stuffed rabbit sat in a place of honor on a throne made from a decorative throw pillow. "This is amazing," Marcus said, and meant it. "You built all this?" "Mama did the engineering," Sophie explained seriously. "I did the decoration and the quality control." "Quality control?" Marcus raised an eyebrow at Elena. She grinned. She crawled through every section to make sure it was structurally sound. Very thorough. "Of course." Marcus settled himself on the floor, his long legs folding awkwardly in the confined space. "So, what does one do in a fort?" Sophie looked at him like he'd asked what one does with air. "You tell stories and eat snacks and hide from dragons, obviously." "Obviously," Marcus repeated. "Are there dragons we need to hide from right now?" "Not right now," Sophie said. "But you never know. That's why you need a fort." Elena laughed, the sound filling the small space with warmth. "She's got a point. You can never be too prepared." They spent the next hour in the fort, reading stories and eating the crackers Sophie had smuggled in. Marcus found himself narrating a tale about a brave princess who saved a kingdom from a dragon, with Sophie adding enthusiastic details about the princess's pet unicorn and magical sword. Elena listened with a soft smile, occasionally catching Marcus's eye over Sophie's head, sharing a moment of perfect understanding. When Sophie eventually got distracted by her rabbit and wandered out to watch cartoons, Marcus and Elena remained in the fort, sitting shoulder to shoulder in the warm, dim light. "Thank you," Elena said quietly, "for all of this. Not just the job and the cottage and Sophie's medical care, though God knows that's more than I could have dreamed of. But for this." She gestured around the fort. "For letting us turn your formal living room into chaos. For reading stories about unicorns when you probably have important work to do. For being here." Marcus turned to face her, and in the soft light of the string lights, she was beautiful. Not magazine cover beautiful or red carpet beautiful, but real and warm and present. "I need to tell you something," he said, his heart hammering. "And I don't want you to feel obligated to respond in any particular way. You work for me, and that creates a power imbalance, and I'm aware of that. But I also can't keep pretending." "Marcus." Elena put her hand over his, stopping his nervous spiral. "What are you trying to say?" He took a breath. "I'm in love with you. With both of you, actually, but especially with you. And I know that's complicated and maybe inappropriate and definitely not what you signed up for when you took this job, but I needed you to know. Because every day I spend with you and Sophie, I feel like I'm becoming the person I was supposed to be all along. You've shown me what matters, what's real. And I'm grateful for that, even if you don't feel the same way." Elena stared at him, her eyes wide, and Marcus felt the seconds stretch into eternities. Then slowly she smiled. "You really are terrible at this, aren't you?" she said, but her voice was gentle, teasing. "At what?" "At reading people." She moved closer, her face inches from his. "Marcus, I've been in love with you for weeks. Maybe months. I didn't say anything because I thought you were way out of my league. Billionaires don't fall for their employees." "This one did," Marcus said, and closed the distance between them. The kiss was soft and sweet and tasted like the future, like possibility and hope and coming home to a place you never knew you were searching for. When they pulled apart, Both smiling like teenagers, Sophie's voice floated in from the other room. Are you kissing in there? Mama, are you kissing the giant? Elena laughed and called back. Maybe. Okay. Sophie yelled. Can we have pizza for dinner? Marcus and Elena looked at each other and burst out laughing, the kind of laughter that comes from pure joy, from the relief of being seen and accepted and loved. Yes, Marcus called back. We can definitely have pizza. With extra cheese? With extra cheese, Elena confirmed, then lowered her voice and said to Marcus, You know what this means, right? You're stuck with us now. That's what I'm counting on, Marcus said, and pulled her close again. 3 months later, on a perfect October afternoon with leaves the color of fire tumbling from the trees, Marcus took Elena and Sophie to the cottage and found it transformed. He'd had his staff work in secret, updating everything, new plumbing, new windows, a renovated kitchen, fresh paint and colors Elena had once mentioned loving. But more than that, he'd had them do something else. In the backyard, where there had been nothing but grass, now stood a small gazebo. Inside it, on a table covered with Sophie's artwork, sat a small velvet box. Elena's hand flew to her mouth when she saw it. Sophie, who'd been briefed on the plan and was vibrating with excitement, grabbed her mother's hand. Open it, Mama. Open it. Elena walked to the gazebo on shaking legs, Marcus following behind, his heart in his throat. She picked up the box and opened it to reveal a ring. Not the biggest diamond in the world, because Marcus had finally learned that value wasn't measured in carats, but beautiful nonetheless, with a central stone the color of Sophie's eyes surrounded by smaller diamonds that caught the autumn light. Elena Martinez, Marcus said, dropping to one knee beside her. You and Sophie have taught me what it means to be alive, to be present, to be human. You've given me a family I didn't know I was missing. Would you do me the incredible honor of letting me make that official? Will you marry me? Elena was crying, nodding, unable to speak. Sophie was jumping up and down, squealing. Yes, Elena finally managed. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. Marcus slipped the ring on her finger and stood, pulling both her and Sophie into his arms. The three of them stood there in the gazebo as the leaves fell around them like blessings, and Marcus thought about the day a small girl in light-up sneakers had broken a vase and, in doing so, had broken open his heart. The wedding was small, held on the estate with only close friends and staff in attendance. Sophie was the flower girl, taking her duties incredibly seriously until she got distracted by a butterfly halfway down the aisle. Elena wore a simple dress the color of champagne and carried wildflowers from the estate's meadow. Marcus cried when he saw her, surprising everyone, including himself. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to the union, Sophie raised her hand. The crowd went silent. Elena and Marcus looked at each other in confusion. Sophie, the officiant said gently, did you want to say something? Yes, Sophie announced in her clear, carrying voice. I object to calling him the giant anymore. From now on, he's Daddy. The laughter and tears that followed were the best sound Marcus had ever heard. He picked Sophie up and held her while he kissed his bride, the three of them a perfect unit, a family built not on blood or obligation but on choice and love, and the courage to let someone in. Later, at the reception held on the lawn under a tent strung with lights, Marcus found himself standing at the edge of the celebration, watching Elena dance with Sophie, both of them laughing. Mrs. Chen appeared beside him, elegant in lavender silk. You did good, Mr. Thornfield, she said quietly. I got lucky, Marcus corrected. Incredibly, impossibly lucky. Luck is being in the right place at the right time. Wisdom is recognizing it and doing something about it. She patted his arm. You were wise enough to see what mattered. Not everyone in your position would have been. Marcus thought about the man he'd been a year ago, so focused on the next acquisition, the next billion, the next achievement that would surely, finally, make him feel complete. That man had been building an empire of things. This man, This version of himself that Sophie and Elena had helped him become was building a life. "I almost missed it," he said quietly. "I almost let them walk out of my life over a broken vase." "But you didn't," Mrs. Chen said. "That's what counts." Sophie broke away from Elena and ran to Marcus, her flower girl dress already stained with grass and frosting. "Daddy, come dance. You have to dance." Marcus let himself be pulled onto the dance floor, where Elena joined them, and the three of them swayed together under the lights as the music played and the stars came out overhead. He held his family close and thought about how the best things in life couldn't be bought or acquired or achieved through determination. They could only be received with open hands and an open heart when you were finally brave enough to stop running and let love catch you. And in that moment, with his wife in his arms and his daughter between them, Marcus Thornfield understood what he'd been searching for in all those conference rooms and corner offices and empty achievements. He'd been searching for this, the feeling of being home in your own life, surrounded by people who saw you and loved you not for what you could do or what you could provide, but simply for who you were. A small girl had stopped him with a hug and shown him what mattered. And he had been wise enough, finally, to listen.